Good afternoon. My name is Jenna Zelmer and welcome to CCK Live. Joining me today are Christian McTarnigan and Mike Lestrito. All three of us are attorneys at Chisholm, and Kilpatrick, practicing veterans benefits law. And today we're going to be talking about some common sleep disorders that veterans experience due to their service. And before we begin, as always, if you have any questions as we discuss this issue, please feel free to leave a question or comment in the box below. We'll do our best to answer that in the session, and if we can't get to it in the session, we'll try to answer it in the comments. And we'll also be including some helpful information via our blog. We'll link that in the comments, and as always, feel free to visit us at cck-law.com. So let's get started. Christian, do you want to start us out by just kind of explaining what some common sleep disorders veterans experience are?
Sure. So we're going to talk about a few during the course of this presentation, this talk, but I think maybe focus on the most common one that we see in veterans first. That would be obstructive sleep apnea or sleep apnea.
Okay, great. And Mike, what is sleep apnea?
So sleep apnea is, I think it's maybe one of the most common conditions that veterans claim in terms of sleep disturbances. And there are really three subsets or three different types of the condition. There's what's called obstructive sleep apnea, which deals with the muscles in a person's throat. They will, from time to time, close and prevent breathing. There's also something called central sleep apnea, which deals with the brain's ability to transmit signals to the muscles of the throat, and that can also cause a veteran to be unable to breathe with a normal frequency. And then finally, there's something called complex or mixed sleep apnea, which is, as it sounds, like a combination of both.
Great. And I think a lot of times veterans that I speak to have trouble because they aren't diagnosed with sleep apnea until much later after service, and they have trouble connecting that sleep apnea to service. So Christian, how exactly is sleep apnea diagnosed, and why is it almost always diagnosed after service?
Yeah, it's almost always diagnosed after service because in order to truly diagnose obstructive sleep apnea, as opposed to maybe, I think we both have had cases, all three have had cases, just snoring or something like that, there needs to be a sleep study. Because like Mike, you said, obstructive sleep apnea medically is the closing of the throat that doesn't allow for proper breathing during sleep, and you have to perform a sleep study in order to get that sort of medical certainty, that that's actually what's causing your sleep problems.
Okay. And, obviously this can be a private exam. It can be a VA examination. We have a lot of material from previous Facebook Lives and also on our website about, service connection and how to get a VA exam and how to how best to use an exam in your favor when you're trying to get service connection. But let's assume that a veteran has met that initial threshold. They've gotten service connection for sleep apnea. Mike, can you talk to us a little bit about how VA rates sleep apnea?
Sure. So the evaluation is rated under diagnostic code 6847. And like all diagnostic codes, VA is looking at the severity of the condition. So it ranges from a 0% rating to a 30% rating to a 50% rating, and ultimately the maximum rating, the 100% rating, is what's afforded under the diagnostic code. The 0% or non-compensable rating is awarded where a veteran does in fact have a diagnosis, but is essentially asymptomatic. A 30% rating that is awarded if a veteran experiences chronic daytime sleepiness, essentially. A 50% rating, which we commonly see here, at least in my practice, is awarded where a veteran needs the use of some type of breathing assistance device, or CPAP as we commonly see it. And that, like I said, that's the most common level of evaluation that I see in my practice in terms of severity. And so, VA will conduct an examination, and then they will rate the condition based on the severity of the condition, assigning one of those appropriate rating schedules.
Yeah, I think one thing I wanted to highlight when you mentioned the 30% rating was that daytime sleepiness. VA calls it hypersomnolence. Yeah. So if you see that word and you're not really sure what that means, it's essentially just excessive sleepiness during the day, which is, linked to not getting enough sleep at night because you can't breathe. And I think, we're going to talk a little bit about other sleep disorders or other disabilities that can result in sleep issues. And a lot of times people suffering from insomnia suffer something similar in terms of having difficulty staying awake during the daytime. And so you just want to make sure, when you're making arguments about kind of the disabilities and the effects that you suffer from your disability, that if you just remember that you need to actually have that diagnosis of sleep apnea in order to get that rating under that code. But there are also other options.
And one thing I'll just add in too, if I could, I know we talked about 3 subsets or different types of sleep apnea. But in terms of rating the condition, a veteran won't receive a separate rating for each of those. The veteran will receive a single combined rating, if you will, for the sleep condition based on that.
Good. Do either of you guys want to talk about kind of why we think sleep apnea is so common among veterans? It's really one of the most common respiratory conditions claimed by veterans, according to VA. So it's both a sleep disorder, and I know that's what we're talking about today, but it is also a respiratory disorder. So
yeah, I would say that I think that it's one of the most common conditions that is claimed basically because there are so many different theories or avenues for veterans to be able to show that it was caused by their service. And so veterans can show, that they're entitled to service connection for this condition based on what we call direct service connection, something in their maybe service records that shows that the sleep disturbance occurred or arose during their time in service. But there are also many other avenues too. So veterans can show that and we'll get into this, but veterans can show that their sleep apnea was caused secondarily to another service-connected condition. And then finally, there are presumptions. There are certain presumptions that can lead to the sleep apnea being service-connected. So my guess is that it's so commonly claimed because there are so many different avenues that veterans can use to ultimately seek service connection for the condition.
Great. And I think, you mentioned secondary service connection, and that's a really nice transition. So we do have an entire Facebook Live all about secondary service connection, but essentially, if you have a service-connected condition and that causes or aggravates another condition, you can get secondary service connection for that second condition. So Christian, do you want to talk a little bit about some common primary service-connected conditions that can later cause or aggravate sleep apnea?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first and foremost would be post-traumatic stress disorder. So unfortunately, a lot of veterans have post-traumatic stress disorder, and there is, I think a correlation between, I think that's the exact word that we between post-traumatic stress disorder and obstructive sleep apnea. So if you have sufficient evidence to show that your post-traumatic stress disorder either caused or made your obstructive sleep apnea worse, you could be entitled to service connection for that. And I know that we're going to have some more information coming soon about that link between PTSD and obstructive sleep apnea. There's links between anxiety and depression, other psychological disabilities, and I think even Parkinson's disease has some links or correlation between having that condition and also having obstructive sleep apnea.
Yeah, so I think if you're service connected for any of these conditions, or really service connected for anything, and you also have sleep apnea, it's really important to talk to your doctor, talk to your DAV or whoever your service representative is, to kind of do some research and figure out if there's any sort of link, because once you claim that, it's VA's job to kind of help you try to substantiate that. I think another important thing is kind of obesity as an intermediate step. Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So veterans who are obese tend to have, I think, a higher propensity for developing sleep apnea. And so what the current rule allows is for veterans to use their obesity not as its own disability for which they can receive compensation, but as kind of a link between a service-connected condition and ultimately getting sleep apnea granted. So what I mean by that is, take an example where a veteran has service connection for maybe their knees and their back. And as a result of those service-connected orthopedic conditions, they're unable to exercise routinely as they used to, or just, engage in any type of physical activity. And as a result of that, they gain weight and they're classified as obese. So veterans could then use their service-connected knee and back condition, link that to the obesity, and then link the obesity as the cause to sleep apnea, and that creates the causal chain really to then get sleep apnea granted.
Yeah.
And that really goes to your point, Jenna, about making sure that you're talking to your doctors, you're talking to advocates about how, if you have obstructive sleep apnea or think you have obstructive sleep apnea, how to get that service connected, because Mike's chain of events isn't simple. And even expounding upon that, if someone has knee pain, right, and they're taking some sort of medication that causes weight gain, right, service connected knee disability causes pain, medication causes weight gain, obesity is linked to the obstructive sleep apnea, that would be another way that someone could be service connected for obstructive sleep apnea. And it might not seem like that would be how it works, but it is. Yep.
Yeah. And if you have any questions, just as a reminder, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. I know that this is a little bit, it's a complicated situation. And I think, just going off on what you guys said, VA's position on using obesity as an intermediate step is fairly recent. The VA Office of General Counsel came out with an opinion just about 2 years ago. And so, they're still kind of figuring out how this applies. And so that's why it's really important to reach out to a rep, someone who's experienced with this type of argument, so that you can make sure that you're making the best argument possible and really giving yourself the best chance of getting service connected.
Yep.
So let's move on. So we said that sleep apnea is probably the most common sleep disorder among veterans, but another really common one is insomnia. So Christian, do you want to talk a little bit about what insomnia is?
Yeah, so I think this is maybe something that people might be a little bit more familiar with. It's sort of used colloquially as I can't sleep, but that's essentially what it is. Insomnia is an inability to stay asleep, fall asleep, have restful sleep, and it leads to sort of a similar, what we sort of, functional effects as maybe sleep apnea, but the cause, could be very different. It typically is very different because if it's an upper respiratory problem, then it would most likely be sleep apnea. But so basically exactly what we use it like in everyday language is just an inability to stay asleep, fall asleep.
And I think that it can actually be diagnosed under the psychiatric diagnosis.
I'm not sure if it certainly was rated
certainly
that
a symptom,
way.
yeah. It's either its own psychiatric diagnosis or it's a common effect of many psychiatric diagnoses. And I think that kind of goes into my next question is how is insomnia rated? And so, Mike, we talked a little bit about how sleep apnea is rated kind of similar to respiratory conditions, right? So it's similar to whether or not you need a CPAP and whether or not you have this chronic respiratory difficulty. But insomnia is rated under the Schedule for Mental Disorders, right?
That's correct. And so what we often see is that insomnia is, for lack of a better word, lumped in with the underlying condition that maybe causes the insomnia. So in my practice here, we often will see a veteran with psychiatric disability, for instance, maybe PTSD, and one of the symptoms or one of the things that leads to insomnia would be that psychiatric condition. And so insomnia then would be rated basically as part of that underlying psychiatric condition under that diagnostic code. So then you wouldn't necessarily receive a separate rating under a separate diagnostic code for insomnia. It will be part of the underlying condition.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the general rating formula for mental disorders, you'll see in the various different levels of disability, they have chronic sleep impairment as one of the symptoms listed. And so there is some overlap there. And so I think sometimes veterans get confused or upset that they're not getting a lot of smaller separate ratings, but it's just important to remember, like you said, that VA will rate different manifestations of a disability under one kind of more wholly encompassing rating.
And on that point too, veterans can experience insomnia due to physical disabilities. So that's something to keep in mind. A veteran with a very severe orthopedic condition, that can keep the veteran up at night.
Absolutely.
And that may not be really contemplated under the diagnostic code
Right.
that a veteran is being compensated for their orthopedic condition. So then you might want to look elsewhere and see whether those additional symptoms are being contemplated or captured, by a different diagnostic code to receive additional benefits.
I think that's a really important
Yeah,
point.
absolutely.
So you really want to look and see what your assigned rating is compensating you for. There's a whole line of cases that most recently culminated in one called Morgan that really emphasized that veterans can be compensated for each individual manifestation of their disability. And so, in Mike's example, if you're being rated for a disability that's only based on range of motion and your limitation of motion, sleep impairment is probably not going to be covered under that rating. And so you can try to get a separate rating, and you can look at the schedule for mental disorders or the sleep apnea schedule to look as a guide for how VA might want to rate that disability or that impairment from that disability. So that's a really good point. And so finally, Mike, you had mentioned before, there are presumptive sleep disorders related to the Gulf War and related to service in Southwest Asia. So first, let's kind of go back a second and talk about, before we move on to that, maybe we'll take this question from Marcus. So Marcus asked, is evidence of snoring enough to establish service connection for a sleep disorder? So do you guys want to take it?
Sure. So
The answer is it depends.
Maybe.
It depends. I would say it depends on the type of evidence and
Sure.
what the ultimate diagnosis is. If you're claiming service connection for sleep apnea, you're still going to need a diagnosis of sleep apnea, and you're going to have to show ultimately, that in-service snoring, if it's well documented in, say, a service record, caused or contributed to your current diagnosis of sleep apnea. So I think the answer really depends, and we probably need more information as well.
Sure. I mean, if someone has a deviated septum or broke their nose in service, right, sleeping might be evidence of it, but it would also have to cause some sort of functional impairment. So possibly, but probably not just on snoring alone.
Right. And I think,
But you never know.
That goes back to my point earlier about, we have a whole Facebook Live about service connection, and it really goes into the different elements of service connection. So if you have a current diagnosis of sleep apnea and you had snoring in service might meet the in-service event or injury element, but you still need that nexus. And, in my practice, I've seen a lot of examiners will say, well, he snored in service, but lots of people snore, and that's not necessarily due to his sleep apnea, especially because he wasn't diagnosed with sleep apnea until several years after service. And that's why it's really
20
hard.
years, 30 years after service,
So it's really hard because a lot of times, the fact that he wasn't diagnosed until after service doesn't necessarily mean it's not related to service, but you really need a good opinion linking that snoring as a manifestation of undiagnosed sleep apnea in service in order to kind of, or maybe an early manifestation of something that later became sleep apnea. So you really have to kind of work with the facts of your specific case and make sure that you have a good doctor who can give you a well-reasoned opinion. So that's a good question. Thanks, Marcus. So let's go back to Gulf War presumptive sleep disorders. And I wanted to, before we get into that, I wanted to kind of you mentioned we do have some information about the Gulf War in general and service in Southwest Asia in general, but for purposes of this discussion, when we're talking about service in Southwest Asia, what exactly, is there a specific time frame? Is there a specific kind of area in Southwest Asia? What are we talking about?
So we're talking about the period from August 2nd, 1990 up and through to the present day. And I think, VA and Congress continue to extend that period out. So veterans that served in Southwest Asia from that date up until the present would qualify potentially qualify under this presumption. And basically what a presumption is it's just it's an ability for veterans to be able to link a condition, their current sleep condition in this instance, to their service, despite the fact that they may not actually have medical evidence that shows a medical nexus connecting the two. So I always think of it as a shortcut, in essence, to getting service connection.
Great. And Christian,
absolutely.
what type of sleep disorders, besides the ones that we've talked about, what type of sleep disorders are specific to service in Southwest Asia?
Yeah, so MUCMI is a complicated concept, but
we have
lots of information. But a medically unexplained chronic multi-symptom illness is what MUCMI stands for. It's one of my favorite VA acronyms. But there are a few. So there's two ways that, just very, very briefly, there are sort of two ways that you can be afforded this presumption. One is having a MUCMI, and there's a whole sort of other host of undiagnosed illness part of the regulation, 3.317. So I think an undiagnosed, so we're under a subheading of undiagnosed. I think the most common would probably be an undiagnosed sleep problem, right? The veteran doesn't. So the whole reason for this presumption is there were so many soldiers coming back from Southwest Asia during that time period with mysterious illnesses that people couldn't diagnose. They didn't know what was going on. So you go to a medical provider, you don't fit in the sleep apnea box, you don't really have insomnia. So that would be one of the ways that you might be able to still get service connection if you were qualified otherwise about the appropriate time in service, the appropriate place where you served. So you might be able to go that route to get service connection. And then you can just skip the whole nexus element. You were there, you have this undiagnosed sleep, you're supposed to be service connected for it.
It's that easy.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Pretty easy to explain, not very easy in practice. There's a lot of litigation about these.
So that's a good point. You talk about undiagnosed illnesses, but you mentioned what a MUCMI is, and I think probably the most common MUCMI that we see in this area is chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah, and that's explicitly in the regulation and the statute.
So MUCMIs are they're hard to kind of figure out, but the regulation does explicitly list 3 specific ones, and so chronic fatigue is one of them, so that makes it a little bit easier than trying to prove that something that's not listed there qualifies as a MUCMI. So good. So Mike, are there any other, sort of disorders related to service in Southwest Asia that maybe wouldn't be presumptively service connected but are an area of interest?
So for veterans who served in Southwest Asia, I think this is kind of a newer area for sure, a developing area, if you will. But many veterans who served during this time period and in this area were required to take a drug called Mefloquine. And Mefloquine basically is an anti-malarial drug, and it was required for veterans to take this, and they took it up until approximately 2013, is my understanding, when the VA decided no longer to issue this particular medicine. It basically came in a small pill, is my understanding, a little white tablet, and veterans oftentimes would take it. It wouldn't always be documented in their service records, which makes it very difficult for veterans to then prove they actually took it. But basically, there's new research, new studies, new opinions out there, which are now linking veterans' Mefloquine poisoning, is how they're phrasing it, to now later conditions such as different sleep conditions, and a whole host of other things as well. But I think for veterans to go down this path, they would have to show some evidence of the fact that they took Mefloquine, and that can be potentially through a affidavit, a lay statement, maybe a buddy statement as well to help establish that. And then they would for sure need some type of medical nexus expert opinion that shows that their Mefloquine use essentially was Mefloquine poisoning, if you will, as I understand it, and that ultimately would lead to the sleep condition that they now have currently diagnosed.
So that's a uphill climb.
I think it's an emerging area.
Yes.
It's something that we should be on the lookout for, and it's something that veterans who served during this time period and in this location, and who know, or maybe they know that they have service records that document this, maybe consider it as an avenue of service connection. And if you're interested, perhaps seek out a medical opinion that could take a look at the case, and
check out our Facebook Live. There's some more information on there.
Absolutely, and maybe they'll maybe they can review your case and provide a favorable opinion.
Yes. Great. Well, thank you for that.
Sure.
So just some closing thoughts. You know, we talked about some of the more common sleep disorders. You know, regardless of what your actual sleep disorder is, you know, what happens, you know, your reading depends on kind of how severe that is. What happens if your sleep disorder prevents you from working, Christian?
Well, that has TDIU written all over it. So like Mike, you said at the beginning, there is a 100% rating option for obstructive sleep apnea. Yep. There is a 100% rating for the mental disorders under 4.130. But if a veteran's condition doesn't meet sort of the letter of the 100, what we call 100% scheduler, there's an alternate avenue that they can take in order to get a 100% rating without getting the scheduler rating, and that's unemployability. Mm-hmm. And this links back to what you were talking about in Morgan. Right. Not only the separate ratings, but just reaffirming VA's duty to maximize benefits. So if you have obstructive sleep apnea, even if it's rated at a 30, and that prevents you from working, you know, you should be entitled to employability benefits, and at the very least, VA needs to adjudicate that issue and take a look at it. We have a lot of information about TDIU on our website, and we've done several Facebook Lives, I'm sure, about it. So there's no lack of information about TDIU. So if you have any questions, please feel free to check out our website. You know, I think we talked a little bit about kind of common errors that VA makes in adjudicating sleep apnea. You know, I mentioned, or in any sleep disorder, you know, I mentioned, particularly for sleep apnea, they really focus on the lack of diagnosis and service. Do you guys have any other kind of common errors that you've seen?
Yeah, so one thing that I see is that VA oftentimes discounts lay evidence. And so, you know, despite the fact that a veteran may not have a well-documented sleep condition in the records, perhaps a veteran, in addition, has provided a lay statement, and the veteran has provided a buddy statement on top of that. And the statements all say that, you know, during my time in service, as confirmed by my buddy, you know, I oftentimes woke up in the middle of the night and had difficulty sleeping. And so, you know, that can go, that should at least be considered. If nothing else, VA should consider that lay evidence in adjudicating the claim. And so I see oftentimes they will completely disregard that and just look to whatever is listed or not listed in the medical records.
And sort of springboarding off that, VA will often not look at that evidence in understanding whether an examination is necessary. So, you know, as we've sort of discussed and highlighted, an exam is really crucial if you want to get service connection for obstructive sleep apnea, because you need a sleep study just medically to actually diagnose that condition. So using Mike's example, you have a buddy statement, a statement from a fellow soldier, or you know, a partner about how you were waking up gasping for breath, right? I'm just making up perfect facts here. You were snoring, you had trouble sleeping. That should be, and we have you know, information on our website about how you get exams. That should be the indication. So you have a current symptoms of a disability of sleep apnea. You have the in-service occurrence in the buddy statements, and then you have some indication, right, that your current symptoms are related to that sort of sleep problems in service. That should be enough to get you an exam. I see VA make mistakes in that arena a lot.
And I think it's really important too to make sure that VA is adjudicating all potential theories of service connection. And so we've outlined a number of them here: direct, secondary, presumptive. VA oftentimes makes a mistake and will only adjudicate one of those, or take a look and consider one of those, when in reality, maybe a veteran is entitled to have, well, for sure the veteran is entitled to have all theories considered, but maybe there are multiple avenues that legitimately a veteran can raise as being entitled to service connection. And so VA really should look at all of those and consider all of those in considering your claim.
Absolutely.
Great. Do you guys have any final thoughts before we leave?
I would, you know, I always emphasize the importance of lay testimony. Buddy statements are really important, especially, as we said, when we're trying to show an in-service event. And so, you know, just because something's necessarily not documented in your medical records doesn't mean you're completely out of luck. And so just keep that in mind.
We highlight this a lot, but go to your exam.
Yes.
You know, veterans may be frustrated with the VA, they may be frustrated with VA medical facilities. that's understandable, but make sure that you go to your examinations. They're incredibly important, and there are rules that VA has that if you skip your examinations, they can deny your claim without nothing more, or just change the rules that they have to, like what evidence they can look at and things like that. So going to your exam is very, very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, going off of your point about VA's rules, and, you most of the time, veterans, when they've gotten to even the exam part of the appeal, they've put in a lot of time and effort.
Yeah, absolutely.
And their appeal has been pending for at least a few years. And so you don't really want to give up all of that time just by not going to an exam. And I think, piggybacking off of that thought, it's just really important to make sure that when you're filing claims and you're going to exams, you're talking to a rep, whether that's a veteran service organization or a private attorney or anyone who kind of has familiarity with this area of law. I think that today's discussion really demonstrated how complicated it is and how many different ways that there are to get service connected for sleep disorders. And so, we want to make sure that you're best prepared in order to give you the best shot at getting your compensation. So thank you for joining us today. Again, my name is Jenna. I'm here with Christian and Mike, and we'll see you next week.